Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will shatter everything you thought you knew about love, marriage, and the simple act of saying, "Will you marry me?" What if I told you that for over 1,000 years, it was literally illegal for women to propose marriage? And I'm not talking about some obscure cultural taboo. I'm talking about actual laws with real punishments that could destroy a woman's life forever. In fact, there was once a time when a woman who dared to ask a man to marry her could be publicly humiliated, stripped of her property, or even exiled from her community. Tonight, we're going to uncover the shocking truth about how society controlled love itself, and why the simple question, "Will you marry me?" became one of the most dangerous things a woman could ever say. Now, before we dive into this incredible story together, I'd love for you to join our community by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy the journey we're about to take. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Are you tucked in bed, or maybe listening while doing something else? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one and love connecting with you all. Make sure your lights are dimmed. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's settle in for a story that spans 2,000 years of human history. Picture this. It's the year 1228, somewhere in medieval England. A young woman named Eleanor has fallen deeply in love with a blacksmith's apprentice named Thomas. They've been meeting secretly for months, sharing stolen glances at the market, whispering conversations by the village well. Eleanor knows Thomas cares for her. She can see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he protects her when drunken men get too close at the tavern. But Thomas is shy, perhaps too intimidated by Eleanor's family's modest wealth to make the first move. So Eleanor makes a decision that will change her life forever. On a crisp autumn evening, she approaches Thomas and speaks the words that no woman of her time was supposed to say. "Thomas, will you be my husband?" What happened next wasn't a fairy tale ending. Within days, Eleanor's family disowned her. The local priest publicly condemned her from the pulpit. Thomas, terrified of the social consequences, fled the village entirely. Eleanor was left with nothing, no family, no reputation, no future prospects for marriage to anyone else. All because she dared to ask the question that men had been asking freely for centuries. This wasn't an isolated incident or some cruel twist of fate. This was the law. Across medieval Europe, complex legal and social codes specifically prohibited women from initiating marriage proposals. The consequences weren't just social embarrassment. They were devastating and permanent. A woman who proposed could lose her inheritance, be banned from church, or even face legal prosecution for disturbing the natural order. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. This wasn't always the case. If we travel back even further in time, to ancient Rome around 100 AD, we find a completely different world. Roman women, particularly those from wealthy families, routinely initiated marriages. They negotiated their own dowries, chose their own husbands, and yes, they proposed. The famous Roman historian Tacitus wrote about powerful women who commanded both their households and their marriage choices with equal authority. Some of the most influential political alliances in Roman history were actually initiated by women who saw strategic value in certain marriages. So what changed? How did we go from a world where women had the freedom to choose their partners to one where asking, "Will you marry me?" could destroy their entire lives? The answer lies in one of the most dramatic social transformations in human history, a shift that would control women's lives for over a millennium. The transformation began around the 4th century AD, when Christianity started gaining political power throughout the Roman Empire. Early Christian leaders, influenced by interpretations of biblical texts about women's roles, began advocating for what they called the natural order of marriage. St. Augustine wrote extensively about how marriage proposals should flow from man to woman, never the reverse, because it reflected God's design for human relationships. But it wasn't just religious ideology driving this change. There was something much more practical and sinister at work: economics. In a world where marriage determined inheritance, property rights, and political alliances, allowing women to initiate proposals meant giving them control over massive wealth transfers. Powerful families realized that if their daughters could choose their own husbands, it might mean marrying for love instead of strategic advantage. The horror. By the 8th century, what had started as religious recommendation had crystallized into actual law across most of Christian Europe. The Frankish legal codes, which influenced law across the continent, explicitly stated that no woman shall make proposal of marriage to any man, for this disturbs the rightful order established by God and nature. The punishment? Forfeiture of property and expulsion from Christian community, essentially, social death. What's fascinating is how these laws were enforced. It wasn't just formal legal prosecution. Medieval society developed an entire network of social surveillance to ensure women stayed in their place. Neighbors would report suspicious behavior. Priests would interrogate young women about their romantic intentions during confession. Even servants were encouraged to spy on their mistresses and report any signs of improper forward behavior. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a woman in 13th century France, deeply in love but forced to wait passively, hoping your beloved would somehow read your mind and propose. Many women developed elaborate systems of hints and signals, creating what historians now call the medieval language of romantic suggestion. They would drop handkerchiefs in strategic locations, wear certain colors, or position themselves in specific places, all desperate attempts to encourage proposals without technically initiating them. Some women tried to circumvent the system through intermediaries. They would have brothers, fathers, or even servants approach men on their behalf. But even these indirect proposals were often discovered and punished. Court records from 14th century England document several cases of women being publicly shamed for directing others to disturb the natural order of courtship. The irony is staggering. These laws claim to protect women's honor and virtue, but they actually created a system where women had less control over their own lives than livestock. A farmer's cow had more say in its mating than a nobleman's daughter had in choosing her husband. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these relationships that could have blossomed into beautiful marriages simply never happened. How many love stories were lost to history because a shy man never found the courage to propose, while the woman who loved him was legally forbidden from speaking her heart? How many brilliant partnerships, both romantic and political, never formed because half of humanity was silenced? This wasn't just about marriage proposals. It was about power, control, and the systematic suppression of women's agency in the most intimate aspects of their lives. What we're looking at is nothing less than the legal codification of romantic inequality, and its effects would ripple through society for centuries. But here's where our story gets really interesting, because even in this system designed to silence them, some women found ways to fight back. Some discovered loopholes that would shock you. Others broke the rules so spectacularly that their stories became legend. And a few exceptional women actually managed to change the system itself. As we journey deeper into this forgotten history, we're going to meet Roman empresses who commanded their own marriages, medieval rebels who risked everything for love, and the one Scottish queen whose decision created a tradition that millions still follow today. We'll uncover the economic forces that really drove these laws, explore the underground networks women created to help each other navigate impossible systems, and discover how 2 world wars finally began to tear down barriers that had stood for over 1,000 years. Let's step back in time to when the world looked very different. Imagine walking through the marble corridors of a Roman villa in 150 AD, where the sound of fountains mingles with animated conversation. Here, we encounter a woman who would make modern feminists proud and medieval lawmakers horrified. Her name was Livia Drusilla, and she didn't wait for anyone to choose her destiny. Historical records from Cassius Dio tell us that Livia actively pursued her second husband, the future Emperor Augustus, while she was still married to someone else. But here's the kicker. This wasn't scandalous behavior, it was Tuesday. In ancient Rome, women from wealthy families wielded power that would have been unthinkable just a few centuries later. They owned property, ran businesses, and yes, they absolutely initiated marriages. The Roman historian Pliny the Younger documented several cases of women proposing to men, describing it as customary among families of distinction. But let me paint you a picture of just how different this world was. Meet Fulvia, who lived around 80 BC. Not only did she propose to 3 different men throughout her life, but she actually led armies into battle when her third husband, Mark Antony, was away. Ancient sources describe her as someone who never yielded to a woman in anything nor to a man in much. When she wanted to marry someone, she simply asked. When they said yes, she planned the wedding. When they disappointed her in marriage, she divorced them and moved on. The Roman legal system supported this freedom through something called sine manu marriage, literally meaning without hand, where women retained control over their own property and decisions. A Roman woman could inherit wealth, manage estates, and enter into marriage contracts on her own terms. The legal text known as the Corpus Juris Civilis specifically protected women's rights to initiate matrimonial bonds when advantageous to their circumstances. Now here's what's absolutely wild. Roman dinner parties regularly featured what they called marriage negotiations, where women would openly discuss potential matches, negotiate dowries, and even make direct proposals to men they found suitable. The poet Ovid wrote about attending such gatherings, describing how women of noble birth spoke their matrimonial intentions as freely as men discussed their political ambitions. Consider the story of Cornelia, mother of the famous Gracchi brothers. After her husband died, she received numerous marriage proposals from powerful men, including King Ptolemy VIII of Egypt. But Cornelia had her own ideas. Historical accounts suggest she actively courted and proposed to a philosopher named Gaius Fannius because she valued intellectual connection over political advantage. When people questioned her choice, she reportedly said, "I choose my companions for their minds, not their armies." This wasn't just about wealthy women either. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals graffiti written by working-class women expressing romantic intentions. One piece of graffiti, discovered in a tavern, reads, "Restituta, take Samius as your man," apparently written by Restituta herself, boldly declaring her romantic choice for all to see. Roman women also developed sophisticated networks for arranging marriages. They held regular gatherings called convivium matrimoniale, marriage dinners, where eligible people could meet and women could express interest without formal proposals. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of speed dating, except women were just as likely to do the approaching as men. The Roman writer Juvenal, though often critical of women's behavior, documented how women would send gifts, letters, and even love poems to men they wished to marry. One surviving papyrus from Egypt contains a letter from a woman named Apollonia to a man named Marcus, writing, "If you find my character suitable and my dowry acceptable, let us proceed with marriage arrangements, for I believe we would suit each other well. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Roman marriage culture was how women used their proposal rights strategically. They didn't just marry for love, they married for political alliance, business advantage, and social mobility. A clever Roman woman could elevate her entire family's status through a well-chosen marriage proposal. Take the case of Cassilia Metella, who identified a rising political star named Pompey and actively pursued him despite his lower social status. She saw potential where others saw risk. Her marriage proposal to Pompey helped launch one of the most powerful political careers in Roman history. When asked why she chose him, she reportedly said, "I marry the future, not the past." Roman society celebrated this female initiative because it served everyone's interests. When women could choose their own marriages, it created stronger political alliances, better business partnerships, and frankly, probably happier relationships. The Roman senator Cicero wrote approvingly of women who take charge of their romantic destinies rather than leaving such important matters to chance or other people's decisions. The religious context was completely different too. Roman gods and goddesses modeled gender equality in relationships. Venus, the goddess of love, was portrayed as an active pursuer, not a passive recipient of attention. Juno, protector of marriage, was depicted as a powerful figure who made her own choices. Roman religious ceremonies actually included rituals where women could pray for courage to approach the men they desired. What's particularly striking is how Roman law protected women who proposed from social retaliation. If a man rejected a woman's proposal rudely or publicly humiliated her for asking, he could face legal consequences for injury to honor. The legal principle was clear: proposing marriage was a legitimate right for both genders. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. As Roman society began adopting Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, everything started to change. Christian leaders looked at this female autonomy and saw not strength, but disorder. They viewed women proposing marriage as evidence of a society that had lost its way. Early Christian writers like Jerome and Chrysostom began preaching that women who initiated marriage proposals were displaying unseemly boldness that contradicted God's design. They argued that just as Eve had led Adam astray by taking initiative in the Garden of Eden, women who proposed marriage were repeating the original sin of female assertiveness. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was relentless. Christian emperors began passing laws that gradually restricted women's marriage rights. By 380 AD, the Theodosian Code included provisions discouraging women from forward behavior in matrimonial matters. What had been celebrated for centuries was suddenly becoming shameful. We can actually track this change through surviving wedding contracts. Early Roman contracts often list the woman as the primary negotiator, but by the 5th century AD, these same documents show fathers and male guardians taking over roles that women had previously handled themselves. The saddest part is reading accounts from women who lived through this transition. A letter discovered in Egypt, dated around 410 AD, includes a woman writing to her sister, "Mother always told us we could speak our hearts to any man we chose, but the priest now says such behavior brings shame to our families. I do not understand how the same action can be virtuous in one generation and sinful in the next." This wasn't just about marriage proposals, it was about the systematic dismantling of female agency that had existed for centuries. Roman women went from being active participants in their romantic lives to passive observers, waiting for others to determine their fates. But what's incredible is that some women refused to accept this new reality. They found ways to resist, to maintain their autonomy even as the legal and social systems turned against them. These early rebels developed strategies that would echo through centuries of resistance, creating underground networks of female empowerment that survived even the darkest periods of suppression. Their stories of defiance and courage set the stage for an even more dramatic transformation. As Christianity gained political power throughout Europe, the restrictions that had begun in Rome would evolve into something far more systematic and oppressive. The next phase of our journey takes us into an era where the very idea of a woman proposing marriage would become not just forbidden, but literally heretical. The year 325 AD marks one of the most pivotal moments in human history, and I'm not talking about politics or war. I'm talking about the moment when love itself became a battleground. Picture the Council of Nicaea, where 300 bishops gathered not just to define Christian doctrine, but to reshape the very foundation of human relationships. What emerged from those marble halls would chain women's hearts for over 1,000 years, but the real architect of this transformation wasn't even at that council. His name was Augustine of Hippo, and his personal struggles with women would literally rewrite the rules of romance for half the planet. Here's a man who couldn't figure out his own love life, yet somehow convinced an entire civilization that he knew how everyone else should handle theirs. Augustine's story reads like a soap opera. Born in 354 AD, he spent his youth in what he later called the cauldron of unholy loves. He had a mistress for 15 years, fathered a child out of wedlock, and by his own admission, struggled with what he termed the chains of carnal desire. But when he converted to Christianity, instead of finding peace with his past, he projected his personal guilt onto an entire gender. In his influential work, The City of God, Augustine wrote that women who initiated romantic relationships were displaying the pride that was the downfall of Eve. But here's what's fascinating and disturbing about his logic. Augustine argued that when a woman proposed marriage, she was essentially reenacting the original sin. In his mind, Eve's mistake wasn't just eating the fruit, but taking initiative in the first place. Therefore, any woman who took romantic initiative was repeating humanity's first rebellion against God. This wasn't just theological speculation. Augustine's writings became the foundation for what would become canon law, the legal system that governed Christian life throughout Europe. His interpretation of biblical passages about women's roles became official church doctrine, and with Christianity's growing political power, church doctrine was becoming civil law. The Synod of Elvira in 306 AD had already begun restricting women's religious roles, but Augustine's influence pushed these restrictions into the most intimate aspects of daily life. By 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius II declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, giving Augustine's ideas the force of imperial law. Here's where things get really sinister. The church didn't just ban women from proposing, they created an entire theological framework that made female initiative a spiritual danger. St. John Chrysostom, known as the golden-mouthed preacher, delivered sermons throughout the Eastern Empire declaring that a woman who pursues a man disturbs the divine order and invites demonic influence into the marriage. Think about how twisted this logic was. The same religion that praised Mary for saying yes to God's proposal was now teaching that women saying yes to earthly romance was inherently evil, unless, of course, they waited for men to ask first. The Council of Carthage in 419 AD went even further, establishing specific penalties for women who displayed forward behavior in matters of matrimony. These weren't just social consequences anymore, they were official ecclesiastical punishments. A woman caught proposing could be denied communion, refused Christian burial, or even excommunicated entirely. But the most devastating change was how Christianity redefined the very purpose of marriage. Roman marriages had been partnerships, business arrangements, political alliances. Christian theology transformed marriage into a spiritual hierarchy where women were explicitly subordinate. The Apostle Paul's letters about wives submitting to husbands, which had been interpreted contextually in earlier periods, now became absolute law governing all romantic relationships. St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, added his own commentary that would influence centuries of Christian thought. He wrote that a woman who proposes marriage reveals a rebellious spirit that makes her unfit for the sacred bonds of matrimony. Law, his Vulgate Bible, completed in 405 AD, included marginal notes reinforcing these interpretations, spreading them throughout the literate Christian world. The Church developed increasingly elaborate justifications for these restrictions. They argued that since Christ was the bridegroom and the Church was the bride, always waiting, always receptive, earthly marriages should mirror this relationship. Women were to be perpetually in the position of the Church, waiting, hoping, but never initiating. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading the personal accounts from this period. A letter from a Christian woman named Marcella, preserved in Jerome's correspondence, reveals the psychological impact. I have been taught that to speak my heart's desire would be to sin against God himself, yet my heart burns with affection that I dare not voice. How can love be both gift and curse? The Church also weaponized fear in ways that were genuinely terrifying. They taught that women who proposed marriage were not just breaking social rules, but literally inviting Satan into their relationships. The Didascalia Apostolorum, a Christian manual from this period, warned that the woman who pursues a man opens a door for the evil one to destroy both their souls. But here's what's absolutely wild. The Church created different rules for different social classes. Wealthy women, whose marriages involve significant property transfers, face stricter scrutiny than poor women. The Church reasoned that when more money was at stake, female initiative posed a greater threat to divine order. A peasant woman might escape with public penance, but a noble woman could lose everything. The transformation wasn't uniform across the Christian world either. In the Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, some Byzantine traditions allowed limited female marriage initiative under specific circumstances. But in the Western Empire, Augustine's influence was so complete that even these exceptions gradually disappeared. Christian art from this period reflects these changing attitudes. Earlier Christian mosaics and frescoes often depicted women as active figures in romantic scenes, but by the 5th century, artistic representations consistently showed women in passive, waiting poses while men approached them. The visual language of romance itself was being rewritten. The Church also created a new profession, marriage counselors who were actually enforcement agents. These matrimonial advisors were tasked with ensuring that all marriages followed proper Christian protocols. They investigated rumors of women who had overstepped their bounds and reported violations to church authorities. Perhaps most devastatingly, the Church began teaching that a marriage initiated by a woman was spiritually invalid, that God wouldn't bless such a union. This meant that even if a couple was happy, if the woman had proposed, their relationship was considered cursed. Imagine the psychological burden of believing your love was literally damned because of who asked the question first. The economic implications were staggering. In Roman times, women who controlled their own marriages also controlled their own wealth. But Christian marriage laws transferred that control to male guardians, fathers, brothers, or the Church itself. When women lost the right to propose, they simultaneously lost economic autonomy that had taken centuries to build. Some women tried to work within the system by developing coded languages for expressing romantic interest. They would speak of divine inspiration to marry certain men, framing their desires as religious visions rather than personal choices. church records from the 6th century document several cases of women claiming angelic visitations that conveniently recommended specific husbands. The psychological impact on men was significant too. Christian teaching now told them that they bore sole responsibility for initiating all romantic relationships. Many men, particularly shy or uncertain ones, struggled under this pressure. Some historical accounts describe men entering monasteries simply to avoid the anxiety of having to propose marriage. But the most tragic aspect was how this system pitted women against each other. Those who followed the rules became enforcers, policing other women's behavior to prove their own righteousness. The solidarity that had existed among Roman women began fragmenting as Christian women competed to demonstrate their submission to church teachings. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking. In less than a century, European society went from celebrating female romantic initiative to criminalizing it. What had been normal behavior for 1,000 years became heretical overnight. Yet even as these restrictions tightened around women's lives like iron chains, the human heart refused to be completely conquered. In the shadows of this new Christian order, women began developing underground networks of resistance, secret languages of love, and ingenious workarounds that would challenge the very foundations of the system designed to silence them. Their creativity and courage in the face of such oppression would spark rebellions that echo through history to this day. Welcome to the Dark Ages, and I mean that quite literally when it comes to women's romantic freedom. If you thought the early Christian restrictions were harsh, you haven't seen anything yet. Medieval Europe turned the suppression of female marriage initiative into an art form, complete with public humiliation, legal torture, and punishment so creative they'd make a horror movie director blush. But let me start with a story that will absolutely blow your mind. In 1157, a young woman named Giselle de Montfort did something that would make headlines if it happened today. She publicly proposed marriage to a knight named Roland during a harvest festival in front of the entire village. What happened next wasn't just rejection. It was a systematic destruction of her entire existence that reveals just how far medieval society was willing to go to control women's hearts. Within hours of her proposal, the local lord ordered Giselle to be placed in something called a scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over her head with a spike that pressed against her tongue, literally preventing her from speaking. She was forced to wear this device for 3 days while being paraded through neighboring villages as an example of what happened to women who spoke above their station. But here's the truly horrifying part. This wasn't considered excessive punishment. This was considered merciful. The alternative penalty for a woman proposing marriage, according to the legal codes of 12th century France, was having her tongue pierced with a hot iron and being banished from all Christian communities. Medieval Europe had transformed Augustine's theological restrictions into a comprehensive legal system designed to crush female romantic agency. The Sachsenspiegel, a German legal text from 1220, explicitly stated that no woman shall make offer of marriage to any man, for this act violates God's order and brings shame upon her family unto the 7th generation. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how detailed these laws became. Different regions developed increasingly specific punishments based on the woman's social status, the man's reaction, and even the method of proposal. In 13th century England, a woman who proposed through a letter faced different penalties than one who spoke her intentions aloud. Written proposals were considered premeditated rebellion, while spoken ones were sometimes dismissed as temporary madness. The French legal code Coutume de Beauvaisis from 1283 includes a section titled "Of Women Who Disturb the Order of Courtship." It describes punishments ranging from public flogging to forced entry into convents, depending on whether the woman was married, single, widowed, or, and this is where it gets really specific, whether she proposed during Lent, which was considered doubly sinful. But medieval society didn't just punish the women. They created an entire infrastructure of surveillance to catch them in the first place. Villages appointed marriage watchers, usually older women who had proven their loyalty to church teachings, whose job was to monitor young women for signs of forward behavior. These women received small payments from the church for successful reports of violations. The psychological warfare was even more sophisticated. Medieval sermons routinely featured stories of women who had proposed marriage and suffered divine punishment, plagues, stillbirths, possessed children, sudden death. The Legenda Aurea, a collection of saints' lives that was the medieval equivalent of a bestseller, included tale after tale of women whose romantic initiatives led to supernatural punishment. One of the most popular stories told throughout medieval Europe was of Saint Uncumber, a fictional saint who supposedly grew a beard overnight to avoid an arranged marriage. But here's the twisted part. The church used this story to discourage women from any form of romantic self-determination. The message was clear. Even trying to avoid an unwanted marriage was so unnatural that it required divine intervention. Medieval art reinforced these messages constantly. Church frescoes and illuminated manuscripts consistently depicted women in passive poses while men approached them. The famous Romance of the Rose, one of the most influential literary works of the medieval period, includes detailed descriptions of why women who initiate romance are spiritually corrupt. The economic control was breathtaking in its completeness. Medieval inheritance laws were specifically designed to ensure that women who might be tempted to choose their own husbands would lose everything. The legal principle of coverture meant that a woman's property automatically transferred to her husband upon marriage, but only if the marriage was initiated properly by the man. Here's where medieval ingenuity really shows. They created financial incentives for men to report women who had proposed to them. In many regions, a man who reported a woman's proposal received a portion of her family's property as a reward for upholding divine order. This turned romantic rejection into a profit opportunity, creating armies of male informants. The court records from this period read like something out of a dystopian novel. In 1234, the French court documented the case of Marie de Chastellux, who was accused of sending a love poem to a local knight. The court didn't just punish Marie, they ordered the poem to be burned publicly while she watched, then forced her to renounce writing unseemly verses for the rest of her life. Medieval punishments also included something called charivari, organized public humiliation, where the entire community would gather to mock women who had violated romantic protocols. These events could last for days, with people banging pots, singing insulting songs, and sometimes forcing the woman to perform degrading acts like crawling on her hands and knees through the village centre. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval control was how they weaponized family relationships. Parents were legally required to report their daughters' improper behaviour or face penalties themselves. The Decretum Gratiani, a 12th century collection of church law, specifically states that fathers who failed to control their daughters' romantic behaviour could be denied communion and excluded from Christian burial. The church also created a network of informants through the confession system. Priests were instructed to ask specific questions about romantic intentions during confession, and they were required to report any admissions of female marriage initiative to church authorities. What should have been a sacred, private conversation became a surveillance operation. Medieval society even regulated the language women could use when discussing marriage. Certain words and phrases were forbidden because they might encourage female initiative. The word desire, when used by women in romantic contexts, could result in accusations of improper forward behavior. Women learn to speak in elaborate circumlocutions, never directly expressing romantic interest. Some regions took surveillance to absolutely paranoid levels. In 14th century Bavaria, young women were required to attend weekly meetings where they recited oaths, promising never to initiate romantic contact. These meetings, called virtue assemblies, were monitored by church officials who looked for signs that women might be planning to break their vows. The psychological impact created what historians now recognize as widespread romantic anxiety among medieval women. Medical texts from the period describe an epidemic of what they called love melancholy, depression and physical illness among women who are forced to suppress their romantic feelings. The 13th century physician Arnaldus de Villanova wrote extensively about treating women who had become physically ill from unexpressed heart desires. But here's what's absolutely fascinating, and where this story takes an unexpected turn. Some medieval women refused to accept this system. They developed incredibly sophisticated methods of resistance that were so clever, so subversive, that many of them worked for centuries without detection. These women created secret networks, developed coded languages, and found loopholes in the law that were so creative they bordered on genius. They turned the very system designed to oppress them into a tool for their own liberation, and incredibly, one of their most successful tactics involved exploiting a bizarre technicality that the church had never considered. A loophole that would eventually evolve into a tradition millions of people still follow today. But their most audacious rebellion was yet to come, because in the midst of this oppressive system, a group of women discovered something that would change everything: a single day, occurring only once every 4 years, when all the normal rules mysteriously didn't apply. February 29th, 1288. A date that would change the course of romantic history forever. On this leap day, something extraordinary happened in the Highlands of Scotland that would create a tradition so powerful it would survive 8 centuries and spread across the globe. But the real story behind leap year proposals isn't the charming fairy tale you've probably heard. It's a tale of brilliant female rebellion, legal loopholes, and one of the most audacious acts of civil disobedience in medieval history. The woman at the centre of this revolution was St. Brigid of Kildare. Except here's the first shock. She wasn't alive in 1288. She had died over 700 years earlier. So how did a long-dead Irish saint become the patron of a women's proposal rights? The answer involves forgery, political intrigue, and a group of medieval women so clever they managed to fool the entire church establishment. Let me take you back to 5th century Ireland, where the real Brigid lived. Historical records from the Annals of Ulster describe her as an abbess who founded the monastery of Kildare around 470 AD. She was known for her fierce independence and her tendency to challenge male church authority. But nowhere in any authentic historical document does Brigid advocate for women's marriage proposal rights. That story was invented over 800 years later. The fabrication began in 1288 when a group of Scottish noblewomen faced a crisis. King Alexander III had died without a clear heir, and during the political chaos, many arranged marriages were being hastily negotiated without women's input. These women needed a way to assert some control over their romantic destinies, but they couldn't directly challenge church law without facing severe punishment. Enter their brilliant solution. They would claim that St. Brigid had negotiated a special agreement with St. Patrick himself, granting women the right to propose marriage one day every 4 years. They even produced a historical document, written on carefully aged parchment with period-appropriate ink, that detailed this supposed agreement. The forged document, which historians now call the Brigid Charter, contained language that was carefully crafted to exploit a loophole in medieval law. It stated that since leap years were unnatural additions to God's calendar, normal social rules didn't apply during the extra day. This was genius because it used the church's own logic against itself. If leap years were supernatural, then supernatural rules could govern them. But here's where the story gets even more incredible. The women didn't just forge one document, they created an entire mythological backstory. They claimed that Bridget had complained to Patrick about women having to wait potentially forever for men to propose, and that Patrick, in his wisdom, had granted women this one day of romantic freedom. The fake legend they created was masterfully constructed. According to their story, Patrick initially offered women the right to propose one day every 7 years, but Bridget negotiated him down to every 4 years by threatening to curse his missionary work. They even included specific dialogue. "If you will not grant women this right," Bridget supposedly said, "then may your converts be as rare as hen's teeth." What makes this forgery so remarkable is how thoroughly these women researched their deception. They studied authentic 5th century Irish manuscripts to mimic the writing style. They learned about medieval ink making to age their documents properly. They even incorporated real historical details about Patrick and Bridget's lives to make their story believable. The document they produced was so convincing that it fooled medieval scholars for centuries. The Bridget Charter was copied and distributed throughout Scotland, Ireland, and eventually England. Monasteries included it in their historical collections. Priests cited it in sermons. It became accepted historical fact. But the most brilliant aspect of their plan was how they framed the tradition. Instead of presenting it as a challenge to church authority, they portrayed it as ancient Christian tradition that had simply been forgotten. They claimed they were restoring religious practice, not rebelling against it. This made it almost impossible for church officials to oppose without seeming to reject authentic Christian history. The tradition spread with remarkable speed. By 1300, court records from across Britain reference leap year proposals as established custom. The legal code Legis Quatua Burgorum from 14th century Scotland actually includes provisions for how leap year proposals should be handled legally, treating them as legitimate marriage negotiations. What's absolutely fascinating is how different regions adapted the tradition. In Ireland, they added the detail that men who rejected leap year proposals owed women compensation, typically a silk gown or a pair of gloves. In Wales, women could propose during the entire leap year, not just on February 29th. In England, the tradition became associated with specific rituals involving the exchange of coins or rings. The economic implications were significant. Medieval society had strict rules about dowries and marriage settlements, but leap year proposals existed in a legal grey area. Some creative women used this ambiguity to negotiate better marriage terms than would normally be possible. Court records from 15th century England document several cases of women using leap year proposals to secure more favourable financial arrangements. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this tradition is how it psychologically transformed medieval women's relationship with romance. For the first time in centuries, women had a sanctioned opportunity to express romantic agency, even if they only used it once every 4 years. The mere existence of this possibility changed how they thought about their romantic lives. Medieval literature from this period shows a noticeable shift in how female characters are portrayed during leap years. The Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, includes references to women's leap year rites. The Romance of the Rose was actually revised in some manuscripts to include a section about February 29th proposals, showing how quickly this tradition became integrated into popular culture. Some medieval women became quite strategic about timing their romantic lives around leap years. Historical accounts describe women who would deliberately delay expressing interest in potential suitors until the next leap year, when they could propose without breaking social taboos. This created a 4-year cycle of romantic planning that shaped entire generations of relationships. The church found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't denounce the tradition without rejecting what appeared to be authentic Christian history, but they also couldn't endorse it without undermining their own teachings about women's roles. Their solution was typically medieval. They acknowledged the tradition while adding so many restrictions and caveats that it became almost meaningless. Church authorities required leap year proposals to follow specific protocols. Women had to fast for 3 days before proposing. They needed permission from a male guardian. The proposal had to be made at dawn, in the presence of witnesses, and followed by immediate confession. These requirements were designed to discourage women from actually using their supposed rights. But many women found ways around these restrictions too. They would arrange for sympathetic witnesses who would testify that proper protocols had been followed. They would obtain their guardian's permission through various forms of coercion or bribery. Some even convinced priests to bend the rules by arguing that truly authentic traditions shouldn't be burdened with modern bureaucratic requirements. The tradition also created an underground economy of leap year services. Women paid scribes to write proposal letters. They hired musicians to perform proposal songs. Some enterprising merchants even began selling special leap year jewelry designed specifically for women to give to men during proposals. What's particularly touching is reading the personal accounts from medieval women who participated in leap year proposals. A letter from 1387, preserved in the archives of Canterbury Cathedral, includes a woman writing to her sister, "Tomorrow is the day that comes but once in 4 years, and I have found courage to speak what my heart has held silent so long." The success of the leap year tradition proved something remarkable. Medieval women were far more capable of organized resistance than historians had previously recognized. This wasn't just about marriage proposals, it was about creating space for female agency within an oppressive system. These women had essentially hacked medieval society, but the leap year tradition was just the beginning. Its success inspired even more creative forms of resistance, and medieval women began developing increasingly sophisticated methods for circumventing the restrictions on their romantic lives. Their ingenuity would soon lead to rebellions so audacious that they would shake the very foundations of medieval marriage law, setting the stage for confrontations that would echo through the centuries. Fast forward to 1837, and we enter an era so obsessed with romantic rules that they literally wrote instruction manuals on how to breathe properly during courtship. Welcome to the Victorian Age, where proposing marriage became more complicated than performing brain surgery, and where a woman suggesting marriage wasn't just scandalous, it was practically a criminal offence against nature itself. But here's what's absolutely mind-boggling about Victorian marriage proposals. They created a system so intricate, so ridiculously detailed, that men needed guidebooks just to figure out how to ask a simple question. And women? They had to master an entire secret language just to hint that they might be interested. We're talking about a society that turned romance into a military operation. Let me paint you a picture of just how insane this got. In 1843, a gentleman's manual called The Laws of Etiquette devoted 47 pages to the proper protocol for marriage proposals. 47 pages. The manual specified everything from the exact time of day proposals should occur, between 3 and 5 p.m, never on Sundays, to the precise angle at which a man should hold his hat while speaking, 22 degrees from vertical, in case you were wondering. But women's restrictions were even more Byzantine. The 1849 edition of The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility included a chapter titled The Art of Encouraging Without Appearing Forward, which contained over 200 specific rules about how women could indicate romantic interest without crossing into improper territory. Rule number 73, and I'm not making this up, stated that a lady may drop her handkerchief in the presence of a gentleman no more than twice in a single week, lest she appear calculating. The Victorians were so paranoid about women overstepping romantic boundaries that they created an entire industry around monitoring female behaviour. Professional chaperones weren't just companions, they were trained observers who could identify the subtlest signs of forward conduct. These women attended special schools where they learned to recognise dangerous behaviours like excessive eye contact, more than 3 seconds, or presumptuous posture, standing too close during conversation. Here's where Victorian society reached levels of absurdity that would make a comedy writer weep with joy. They developed something called the language of flowers, where different blooms conveyed specific romantic messages, but they didn't stop at simple symbolism. They created regional dialects. A yellow rose meant different things in London versus Edinburgh. Women needed to memorise hundreds of floral combinations just to have a conversation. And if you think that's complicated, wait until you hear about the fan language. Victorian women used fan movements to communicate romantic interest, but the system was so complex it required actual study. Fanning slowly meant "I am engaged," fanning quickly meant "I wish to speak with you," and dropping your fan meant "we are being watched." There were over 50 recognised fan signals, and using them incorrectly could send wildly inappropriate messages. But the most bizarre aspect of Victorian romance was something called calling cards. When a woman wanted to encourage a man's attention, she couldn't just tell him, she had to orchestrate an elaborate system of card exchanges. The size of the card, the quality of paper, even the time of day it was delivered all carried specific meanings. A card delivered on Tuesday meant something entirely different from the same card delivered on Thursday. The psychological pressure on Victorian women was absolutely crushing. Medical journals from the 1850s document an epidemic of what doctors called romantic hysteria, physical and mental illness caused by the stress of navigating impossible courtship rules. Dr. William Acton, a prominent Victorian physician, wrote extensively about treating women who had suffered nervous collapse from the anxiety of romantic uncertainty. Consider the story of Margaret Oliphant, a Victorian writer who left detailed diaries about her romantic life. In 1854 she wrote, "I have loved Charles for 3 years, and I believe he cares for me, but I dare not give him the slightest encouragement lest I be thought forward. I have dropped 17 handkerchiefs in his presence, worn yellow flowers to 4 social gatherings, and fanned myself according to proper signals. Yet he seems oblivious. I fear I shall die of unexpressed affection." The Victorians also created legal mechanisms to punish women who violated romantic protocols. The concept of breach of promise lawsuits meant that if a woman's behaviour could be interpreted as too encouraging, and the man didn't propose, she could be sued for leading him on. But if she wasn't encouraging enough, she could be labelled a spinster and socially ostracised. Women had to navigate a razor-thin line between encouragement and impropriety. What's particularly disturbing is how Victorian society weaponised shame against women who showed any romantic initiative. They created public rituals of humiliation for women who overstepped. The practice of cutting meant that an entire social circle would simultaneously refuse to acknowledge a woman's existence if she violated romantic protocols. She would become invisible in her own community. The economic control was even more sophisticated than in medieval times. Victorian inheritance laws included morality clauses that could strip women of their inheritances if they displayed unseemly romantic behaviour. The legal definition of unseemly was deliberately vague, giving families enormous power to control their daughters' romantic choices through financial threats. But here's where Victorian hypocrisy reached truly spectacular heights. While women faced these crushing restrictions, Victorian society was absolutely obsessed with romantic love. They consumed romance novels, attended romantic plays, and filled their homes with romantic art. They wanted all the emotion of romance but none of the female agency that made it possible. The contradiction created what historians now recognize as Victorian romantic schizophrenia. Society simultaneously celebrated passionate love while criminalizing half of the emotional expressions that created it. Women were expected to be romantic but not romantic, passionate but not passionate, interested but not interested. Some Victorian women developed incredibly creative workarounds. They would hire male friends to coincidentally encounter the men they liked and mention how wonderful these women were. They created elaborate social events designed to throw them together with specific men. Some even wrote anonymous love letters, hoping to inspire proposals without technically initiating them. The era also saw the rise of professional matchmakers who operated in legal grey areas. These women claimed to be social coordinators, but they actually orchestrated romantic encounters for women who couldn't pursue men directly. They charged substantial fees for what amounted to romantic espionage services. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian romance was how it pitted women against each other in competition for male attention. Since women couldn't express interest directly, they had to outmaneuver each other through increasingly subtle social signals. The solidarity that had existed among medieval women during their resistance movements was replaced by ruthless romantic competition. Victorian literature from this period reveals the psychological toll. Charlotte Bronte's letters to her publisher contain heart-wrenching descriptions of watching women she knew wither away from unexpressed love. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote about the epidemic of spinsterhood among women who couldn't navigate the impossible romantic requirements. The medical establishment contributed to women's oppression by creating pseudo-scientific justifications for romantic restrictions. Victorian doctors claimed that women who expressed romantic interest too directly suffered from nervous disorders that made them unfit for marriage. They prescribed treatments ranging from cold baths to laudanum addiction to cure women of excessive romantic feelings. But the most insidious aspect of Victorian romance culture was how it convinced women that their natural romantic impulses were pathological. Women internalized the belief that wanting to express love was a form of mental illness. They sought medical treatment for having normal human emotions. Yet even in this oppressive environment, some Victorian women refused to accept defeat. They began forming secret societies dedicated to romantic rebellion. They developed underground networks for sharing information about sympathetic men. They created coded languages that allowed them to communicate romantic intentions without detection. Their resistance would soon evolve into something far more dangerous to the established order, because as Victorian women grew increasingly frustrated with impossible romantic restrictions, they began to question not just marriage laws, but the entire system of male authority that these laws represented. Their romantic rebellion was about to become a full-scale war for women's rights, with consequences that would reshape society forever. Now here's where things get absolutely fascinating, and frankly, terrifying. Behind all those romantic restrictions, behind every rule about who could propose to whom, lay a truth so stark that it would make your jaw drop. This was never really about love, etiquette, or divine order. This was about money, cold, hard cash. And the amounts we're talking about would make today's billionaires look like they're playing with pocket change. Let me blow your mind with some numbers. In 1860s England, when a wealthy woman married, she didn't just bring a dowry, she brought what economists now calculate as the equivalent of $50 to $200 million in today's money. We're talking about fortunes that could fund entire armies, build railways across continents, or establish industrial empires. And here's the kicker. The person who controlled marriage proposals controlled who got access to all that wealth. But the real story isn't just about individual fortunes. It's about how marriage proposals became the ultimate weapon in economic warfare between the most powerful families in Europe. These weren't just romantic decisions. They were hostile corporate takeovers disguised as love stories. Consider the Rothschild family strategy, documented in their private correspondence held at the Rothschild Archive in London. Nathan Rothschild wrote to his brother in 1815, "We must ensure our daughters marry only men we select, for their romantic inclinations could bankrupt our empire in a single generation." The Rothschilds literally forbade their daughters from expressing romantic interest in anyone, instead arranging marriages that consolidated banking power across 5 countries. But here's where it gets really sinister. The restriction on women proposing wasn't just about preventing bad marriages, it was about preventing women from making strategic alliances that their families hadn't approved. When women could choose their own husbands, they might choose based on love, compatibility, or even their own business interests rather than their father's financial strategies. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Economic historians have calculated that between 1800 and 1900, marriage-controlled wealth transfers in Britain alone totaled over $2 trillion in today's money. That's more than the GDP of most modern countries. Every single one of those transfers was controlled by men because women weren't allowed to initiate the marriages that would determine how the money moved. Let me tell you about Lady Charlotte Guest, whose story reveals just how ruthless this system could be. In 1833, Charlotte inherited ironworks worth approximately $400 million in today's money when her husband died. But there was a catch. If she remarried without her male guardian's approval, she would lose everything. When Charlotte fell in love with her children's tutor and wanted to propose to him, her family literally imprisoned her in her own house to prevent the marriage. They kept her under house arrest for 2 years until she agreed to marry a man they had chosen, ensuring the ironworks stayed under their control. The legal mechanisms for economic control were incredibly sophisticated. Something called strict settlement laws meant that wealthy women's property was held in trust, controlled by male relatives who could cut off access if the women made inappropriate romantic choices. The threat was simple: propose to the wrong man, or even encourage the wrong man to propose, and lose everything you'll ever inherit. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Men were literally terrified that women might use marriage proposals strategically. They knew that if women could choose their own husbands, they might pick men who would actually serve women's interests instead of their family's financial strategies. The entire system of male economic dominance depended on controlling women's romantic choices. Consider the case of the Duke of Marlborough's family in the 1890s. They were facing bankruptcy due to bad investments, but they had a secret weapon, an unmarried daughter. They arranged her marriage to railroad heir William Vanderbilt Jr., which brought $200 million, in today's money, into the family coffers. But here's the horrifying part. Private family letters reveal that the daughter had actually fallen in love with a poor artist and wanted to propose to him. The family response: they had her declared temporarily insane and locked in an asylum until she agreed to the profitable marriage. The insurance industry actually developed around protecting families from daughters' romantic choices. Marriage insurance policies paid out if a daughter married against family wishes, compensating families for lost economic opportunities. Lloyd's of London wrote hundreds of these policies in the 19th century, treating women's romantic freedom as an insurable risk like fire or theft. Some families employed what were essentially romantic secret police. They hired investigators to monitor their daughters' interactions with men, looking for signs of unauthorized romantic interest. These agents would infiltrate social circles, bribe servants, and even intercept letters to prevent unsuitable romantic connections. The Astor family spent what would be millions of dollars annually on this kind of romantic surveillance. The psychological manipulation was even more sophisticated than the legal control. Wealthy families would deliberately expose their daughters to eligible men, while simultaneously convincing them that expressing interest would bring shame. They created artificial scarcity around suitable husbands, making daughters grateful for any proposal rather than encouraging them to pursue men they actually wanted. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the private diaries of wealthy Victorian women. These documents, many held in archives like those at Harvard's Schlesinger Library, contain heartbreaking accounts of women who understood exactly how the economic system worked. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote in 1851, "I am not naive about my value. I am worth £300,000 and 3 estates. But I am also worth nothing, for I cannot choose how to deploy my own assets. I am a fortune with legs, walking toward whatever marriage my guardians select." The international implications were staggering. Marriage alliances between wealthy families from different countries essentially functioned as economic treaties. When the Vanderbilts married into British aristocracy, they weren't just joining families, they were creating transatlantic business partnerships worth hundreds of millions. Women's romantic restrictions were literally shaping international economics. Some families took economic control to absolutely paranoid extremes. The Astors maintained detailed files on every man their daughters encountered, including financial reports, character investigations, and what amounted to romantic credit scores. They ranked potential suitors by economic value and actively sabotaged relationships with men who scored too low. The most heartbreaking aspect was how this system turned women's own romantic feelings into weapons against them. Families would identify which men their daughters liked, then use threats against those men's careers or reputations to force daughters into compliance. Love became a vulnerability that could be exploited for financial control. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Some women began to understand the economic game and decided to play it themselves. They started forming secret alliances with other wealthy women, sharing information about family finances and creating support networks for resisting economic manipulation. These early investment clubs were actually romantic resistance movements. The most brilliant women figured out how to use the system's own logic against itself. They would identify men who were wealthy enough to satisfy their families, but also sympathetic to women's rights. Then they would orchestrate elaborate social scenarios designed to make these men propose, essentially arranging their own marriages while maintaining the fiction that men had initiated everything. Some women even began secretly funding men they wanted to marry, helping them achieve the financial status that would make them acceptable suitors. They would anonymously invest in their businesses, buy their artwork, or even arrange profitable contracts for them. It was like a romantic venture capital system operated entirely by women. But the most audacious economic rebellion was yet to come, because as these wealthy women began to understand how money and marriage intersected, they started to ask a dangerous question. If their romantic choices were being controlled for economic reasons, What would happen if they simply refused to marry at all? Their answer would create an entirely new model of female economic independence that would shake the foundations of society itself. But sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places, and our story is about to take a turn that will absolutely blow your mind. Because some women decided they'd had enough of waiting for permission to love. They broke the rules so spectacularly, so courageously, that their stories became the stuff of legend, and their rebellions changed the world forever. Meet George Sand. Yes, that was actually her name. And no, she wasn't hiding her gender to fool anyone. Born Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupin in 1804, she became one of the most scandalous women in European history by doing something absolutely unthinkable. She proposed to men, multiple men, publicly. And she didn't just get away with it, she became famous for it. But here's what makes George Sand's story so incredible. She wasn't just breaking romantic rules, she was dismantling the entire system. In 1831, she walked into a Parisian salon wearing men's clothing, approached the famous poet Alfred de Musset, and said, and I'm quoting from his memoir, "Monsieur, I find you fascinating and believe we should become lovers. Are you interested?" The entire room went silent. This kind of direct romantic proposition from a woman was literally unprecedented in European society. What happened next shocked everyone, including Sand herself. Instead of being scandalized, Parisian society was electrified. Sand's boldness became the talk of Europe. Suddenly, everyone wanted to meet this woman who dared to speak her romantic desires openly. She wasn't destroyed by breaking the rules, she became more powerful because of it. Sand's success inspired a wave of what historians now call romantic rebels, women across Europe who began openly proposing to men. The French writer Simone de Beauvoir documented over 200 cases of women following Sand's example between 1830 and 1850. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a growing movement of romantic rebellion. Consider the story of Countess Marie de Gouges, who in 1833 approached the composer Franz Liszt at a concert and declared, "Maestro, I believe we are destined to create beautiful music together, both artistically and romantically. Will you be my companion?" Their resulting relationship lasted 6 years and produced 3 children, including future composer Cosima Wagner. What's remarkable is that de Gouges faced no social consequences for her boldness. Instead, she became a celebrated salon hostess whose gatherings attracted Europe's intellectual elite. But perhaps the most extraordinary rebel was Princess Cristina Trivulzio di Belgiojoso, an Italian aristocrat who turned marriage proposals into political acts. In 1836, she publicly proposed to 3 different men in a single month, not because she loved them all, but to demonstrate that women should have the same romantic freedom as men. Her actions sparked what newspapers called the proposal riots, public demonstrations where hundreds of women demanded the right to express romantic interest openly. The British writer George Eliot, born Mary Ann Evans, documented her own romantic rebellions in letters now held at Yale's Bynecker Library. In 1849, she wrote to the philosopher Herbert Spencer, "My dear Herbert, I find myself in the extraordinary position of being a woman who knows her own mind regarding matters of the heart. I propose that we explore a romantic connection, should you find the idea agreeable." Their correspondence reveals that Spencer was initially shocked but ultimately flattered by her directness. What's absolutely fascinating is how these women's success started changing men's attitudes. The French novelist Gustave Flaubert wrote in 1852, "I confess I find women who know what they want romantically to be far more intriguing than those who wait passively. There is something thrilling about being chosen rather than doing the choosing. This was revolutionary thinking for the time. The rebellion wasn't just happening among wealthy aristocrats either. Working-class women began following their example in ways that were just as bold. The London Times documented the case of Margaret O'Brien, a seamstress who in 1845 proposed to her supervisor by embroidering her proposal into a piece of fabric she was working on. When he discovered the message, instead of reporting her for inappropriate behaviour, he accepted her proposal and they married within the month. Perhaps the most audacious romantic rebel was the American actress Ada Isaacs Menken, who turned marriage proposals into theatrical performances. In 1856, she proposed to the writer Alexander Dumas by having it written into a play script, then performing the proposal on stage in front of hundreds of people. The audience was so captivated that they gave her a standing ovation. Dumas, watching from the wings, immediately accepted. But the rebel who really shattered the system was Queen Victoria herself. Here's a fact that will absolutely blow your mind. Queen Victoria proposed to Prince Albert. In 1839, royal protocol actually required her to propose because as the reigning monarch, no one could propose to her without committing treason. But instead of treating this as a bureaucratic necessity, Victoria embraced it as romantic empowerment. Victoria's own diary, preserved in the royal archives, contains her account of the proposal. I felt a strange exhilaration in being the one to speak the words. Albert seemed surprised but delighted by my directness. I realized that in proposing to him, I was not just choosing a husband, but asserting a kind of romantic authority I had never imagined possible. What's remarkable is how Victoria's example rippled through society. If the Queen could propose marriage, what was stopping other women? Victoria's boldness gave romantic rebels across the British Empire a powerful precedent to point to when they faced criticism for their own proposals. The ripple effects were international. The American suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in 1848, "Queen Victoria's proposal to Prince Albert proves that women are perfectly capable of taking romantic initiative. If it is appropriate for our Queen, surely it is appropriate for the rest of us." Stanton herself went on to propose to her husband Henry, telling him, "I believe in equality in all things, including matters of the heart." Some women developed incredibly creative proposal methods that became legendary. The French painter Rosa Bonheur proposed to her partner Nathalie Micas by painting a portrait that included hidden symbols spelling out her proposal. The Italian opera singer Giuditta Pasta proposed to the tenor Giovanni Battista Rubini by having a proposal written into an aria and performing it during a live opera. These weren't just romantic gestures, they were artistic statements about women's right to romantic expression. The success of these romantic rebels created what historians call the proposal revolution of the 1840s and 1850s. Women's magazines began publishing articles about the new romantic freedom. Etiquette manuals started including sections on how women could appropriately express romantic interest. The entire social conversation about romance was shifting, but perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Women who had spent their entire lives believing that expressing romantic interest was shameful suddenly saw examples of women being celebrated for their boldness. The French feminist Flora Tristan wrote in 1843, "These brave women have shown us that romantic courage is not masculine or feminine. It is simply human." The economic implications were just as revolutionary. When women could choose their own romantic partners, they began making choices based on compatibility and genuine affection, rather than family financial strategies. This created what economists now recognize as the first wave of romantic market efficiency. Marriages that were more likely to succeed because they were based on mutual choice rather than external pressure. Some families tried to suppress news of these romantic rebels, fearing their daughters might be inspired to similar boldness. But the stories spread anyway, often becoming more dramatic in the retelling. By 1850, romantic rebellion had become so common that the London press coined the term proposal ladies to describe women who took romantic initiative. The religious establishment found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't condemn Queen Victoria without committing treason, but her example was inspiring exactly the kind of female romantic agency they had spent centuries trying to suppress. Some progressive clergy began arguing that if God had made Victoria queen, perhaps he approved of women taking romantic leadership. International marriage laws began changing in response to the proposal revolution. Several German states modified their legal codes to explicitly protect women who made marriage proposals from discrimination. The Swiss canton of Geneva passed laws making it illegal for employers to fire women for proposing marriage. These legal changes reflected growing social acceptance of female romantic initiative. But the most profound change was cultural. For the first time in over 1,000 years, women proposing marriage was becoming socially acceptable again. The romantic rebels had succeeded in breaking chains that had bound women's hearts for centuries. Their courage was creating space for a new kind of romantic equality. However, this revolution was about to face its greatest test, because as women's romantic freedom grew, conservative forces were organizing a backlash that would threaten to undo everything these brave rebels had accomplished. The battle for women's romantic rights was far from over, and the next phase would require even greater courage. But every revolution faces its reckoning, and the romantic rebels were about to discover just how brutally society could strike back when its fundamental power structures were threatened. What happened to women who dared to break the ultimate romantic taboo wasn't just punishment. It was systematic destruction designed to terrify others into submission. The backlash began in 1847 with a case that shocked Europe and revealed the true cost of romantic rebellion. Her name was Lady Caroline Norton, and her crime was unforgivable. She had fallen in love with someone her husband didn't approve of, and she had told that man how she felt. What happened next became a cautionary tale that parents would tell their daughters for generations. Caroline's husband, George Norton, didn't just divorce her. He orchestrated what can only be described as legal annihilation. Using a law called criminal conversation, he sued Caroline's lover for damages, claiming that Caroline's romantic expression had stolen his property. But here's the twisted part. Caroline herself couldn't defend herself in court because married women had no legal standing. She could only watch as men debated the monetary value of her affections. The court awarded Norton £2,500, approximately $300,000 in today's money, as compensation for his wife's romantic initiative. But that was just the beginning. Norton then used the doctrine of coverture to seize all of Caroline's property, including money she had earned from her own writing. He even claimed ownership of her future earnings, essentially turning her into an economic prisoner. But the cruelest punishment was yet to come. Norton legally kidnapped their children and forbade Caroline from seeing them. Under British law, a woman who had violated the sanctity of marriage through romantic impropriety lost all parental rights. Caroline spent 4 years fighting in court just to see her own children, ultimately winning only supervised visits of 2 hours per month. Caroline's case wasn't unusual. It was typical. Legal records from the 1840s document hundreds of similar cases where women faced what lawyers called romantic annihilation for expressing unauthorized feelings. The message was clear: step out of line romantically and lose everything you've ever loved. The psychological warfare was even more devastating than the legal persecution. Society developed what historians now call scarlet letter systems. public marking and shaming of women who had violated romantic protocols. In small towns, women who had proposed marriage or expressed interest in inappropriate men were forced to wear specific colours or symbols that identified their romantic crimes to the entire community. The medical establishment joined the attack with pseudoscientific theories about romantic hysteria in women. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a prominent Victorian physician, claimed that women who expressed romantic initiative suffered from a mental illness that could only be cured through surgical removal of the clitoris. This barbaric procedure was performed on hundreds of women throughout the 1850s and 1860s, often without their consent, as treatment for romantic assertiveness. Religious persecution was equally brutal. The Catholic Church created a new category of sin called presumptuous courtship, specifically to target women who took romantic initiative. Women confessing to having proposed marriage or expressed unauthorized romantic feelings faced penances that could include years of public humiliation, exclusion from communion, and in extreme cases, excommunication. The story of Maria Rossetti, sister of the famous poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, illustrates the psychological torture these women endured. In 1852, Maria fell in love with a struggling artist and wrote him a letter expressing her feelings. When the letter was discovered by her family, they had her committed to an asylum for romantic delusions. She spent 2 years in confinement, undergoing treatments that included ice baths, starvation diets, and forced medication designed to cure her of romantic feelings. Economic punishment was swift and merciless. Women who violated romantic protocols found themselves blacklisted from employment, refused service by merchants, and socially ostracized to the point where survival became nearly impossible. The romantic reputation system meant that a single act of romantic initiative could destroy a woman's entire future prospects. Insurance companies began offering moral risk policies to protect families from daughters' romantic choices. These policies paid out if a daughter's improper romantic behavior caused financial or social damage to the family. The existence of such insurance reveals how seriously society took the threat of female romantic agency. Some families took preventive measures that bordered on imprisonment. Wealthy households employed romantic guards, servants whose specific job was to monitor young women for signs of unauthorized romantic interest. These guards reported directly to male family heads and could trigger immediate intervention if they suspected romantic infractions. The surveillance extended to correspondence monitoring. Private companies offered services to screen women's mail for romantic content. The Domestic Purity Agency, operating out of London in the 1850s, employed dozens of women to read and report on suspicious letters written by other women. They maintained files on thousands of women, tracking their romantic communications and reporting violations to families or employers. Perhaps the most heartbreaking punishments involved forced marriages as corrections for romantic misconduct. Women who had expressed interest in inappropriate men were sometimes married off immediately to men selected specifically for their willingness to discipline wives who had shown romantic initiative. These corrective marriages were essentially legalized abuse systems designed to break women's spirits. The international scope of the backlash was staggering. Conservative governments across Europe began coordinating efforts to suppress female romantic agency. The Congress of Vienna in 1848 included discussions about managing the problem of romantic rebellion among women. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals conversations about standardizing punishments for women who violated romantic protocols. Some women faced criminal prosecution under laws that hadn't been enforced for centuries. The medieval crime of disturbing the peace through unseemly romantic behavior was revived in several jurisdictions specifically to prosecute women who had taken romantic initiative. Women could face jail time for the crime of expressing love to the wrong person at the wrong time. The psychological impact on other women was exactly what authorities intended. Witnessing the destruction of romantic rebels terrified countless women into complete romantic passivity. Diaries from this period contain heartbreaking entries from women who admitted to loving men but were too frightened by the potential consequences to express their feelings. Yet even in the face of such brutal persecution, some women refused to surrender. They developed increasingly sophisticated methods of resistance, creating underground networks that provided support for women facing romantic punishment. These networks offered everything from financial assistance to safe houses for women fleeing abusive, corrective marriages. The most remarkable resistance came from women who decided to document their persecution. They began secretly recording the punishments they witnessed, creating archives of abuse that would later become crucial evidence for legal reform movements. These brave women turned their suffering into weapons for future battles. International rescue networks emerged to help women escape romantic persecution. Progressive activists in countries with more liberal laws began smuggling persecuted women across borders, providing them with new identities and opportunities to start fresh lives where their romantic histories couldn't be used against them. But perhaps the most powerful form of resistance was simply refusing to be broken. Some women emerged from their punishments more determined than ever to fight for romantic freedom. Their experiences of persecution became fuel for a larger movement that would soon challenge not just marriage laws, but the entire system of male authority over women's lives. The backlash had achieved exactly the opposite of what authorities intended. Instead of terrifying women into submission, the brutal punishment of romantic rebels was radicalizing an entire generation of women who began to see the connections between romantic oppression and broader systems of female subordination. Their anger was building into something that would soon explode into the most significant challenge to male authority in human history. Everything we've discussed so far might seem like ancient history, but here's something that will completely change your perspective. In 1848, something happened across the Atlantic that would prove European romantic restrictions weren't universal laws of nature. They were artificial constructs that could be completely reimagined. Welcome to the American frontier, where desperation, pragmatism, and sheer distance from European authority created the most romantically liberated society in human history. Picture this. It's 1849, and Sarah Mitchell is standing outside a mining camp in California with 200 other women, facing 10,000 men who haven't seen a woman in months. The usual rules of courtship, absolutely meaningless. The complex protocols about who could propose to whom, completely irrelevant. In the American West, women didn't just have the right to propose marriage, they had the power to auction off that right to the highest bidder. The numbers alone tell an incredible story. By 1850, the California gold rush had created a gender ratio of 12 men for every woman in some mining camps. In the Dakota Territory, it was 20 to 1. In parts of Montana, it reached 50 men for every woman. These weren't societies where women had to worry about being too forward. They were societies where women who weren't forward enough would literally starve. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Instead of being passive recipients of male attention, American frontier women turned romantic scarcity into economic opportunity. They didn't just choose their husbands, they made men compete for the privilege of being chosen. The famous bride ship expeditions brought unmarried women from the East Coast to frontier settlements, where they would literally interview prospective husbands and select the most promising candidates. Consider the story of Eliza Hart, who arrived in Seattle in 1864 on one of these bride ships. According to her diary, now held at the Washington State Historical Society, she received 47 marriage proposals in her first week, But instead of accepting the first offer, she spent 3 months systematically interviewing suitors, evaluating their financial prospects, compatibility, and what we'd now call emotional intelligence. When she finally chose blacksmith Thomas Brennan, it was because she had determined he offered the best combination of security and partnership. The economic empowerment was unprecedented. Frontier women routinely negotiated marriage contracts that would have been unthinkable in Europe. They demanded equal say in business decisions, insisted on property rights, and often required their husbands to sign agreements giving women control over household finances. The standard American frontier marriage contract looked more like a business partnership agreement than a traditional subordination document. Some women took entrepreneurial approaches that were absolutely revolutionary. Mary Catherine Horney, better known as Big Nose Kate, became famous for proposing to multiple men simultaneously and making them compete through a bidding process. She would announce her availability and let interested men make offers that included not just romantic devotion, but land, money, business partnerships, and guarantees of equal treatment. She married the highest bidder, but only after negotiating terms that gave her unprecedented freedom and authority. The religious landscape was completely different too. Frontier preachers, desperate to establish stable communities, actively encouraged women to take romantic initiative. The Reverend William Taylor, who ministered to California mining camps, wrote in 1853, "In these circumstances, it would be folly to insist on old-world courtship customs. I encourage women to speak their hearts plainly, for marriages are the foundation of civilization, and civilization cannot wait for timid men to find courage." But perhaps the most radical development was the emergence of what historians call partnership marriages, relationships where women and men genuinely shared power and decision-making. Because frontier life required both partners to work and take risks, the European model of female subordination simply didn't function. Women who could shoot bears, manage farms, and run businesses weren't going to accept inferior status in their marriages. The legal framework supported this equality in ways that shocked European visitors. Frontier territories routinely passed laws giving married women property rights, business authority, and even divorce rights that wouldn't exist in Europe for decades. The Wyoming Territory granted women full suffrage in 1869, 50 years before most European countries, largely because frontier society had already established that women were equal decision-makers in the most important choice of all, marriage. International observers were absolutely stunned by American romantic culture. The British traveller Isabella Bird wrote in 1873, "American women possess a romantic freedom that would scandalize London society. They choose their own husbands with a directness that is both shocking and admirable. Yet their marriages appear more harmonious than those arranged by European families, perhaps because they are based on genuine choice rather than obligation." The speed of frontier courtship was breathtaking compared to European standards. While Victorian couples might court for years before engagement, frontier couples often moved from introduction to marriage in weeks or even days. This wasn't recklessness. It was pragmatic adaptation to circumstances where delayed decisions could mean lost opportunities or even death. Some frontier women developed group proposal strategies that were incredibly sophisticated. In communities with extreme gender imbalances, women would form collectives to evaluate potential husbands. They would pool information about men's characters, finances, and prospects, then collectively negotiate with the most desirable candidates. These marriage committees essentially gave women collective bargaining power in romantic negotiations. The cultural impact rippled back to Europe through letters and newspapers. European families with relatives in America received detailed accounts of women's romantic freedom, and these stories inspired European women to question their own restrictions. The American example proved that female romantic agency didn't destroy society. It actually created stronger, more stable communities. Economic data from frontier settlements reveals something remarkable. Communities where women had romantic freedom experienced lower divorce rates, higher birth rates, and greater economic prosperity than communities that maintained traditional European restrictions. When women could choose compatible partners, marriages succeeded more often and produced more stable families. The psychological liberation was equally significant. American frontier women's diaries contain remarkably confident discussions of romantic choice that contrast sharply with the anxiety and uncertainty found in European women's writings from the same period. American women wrote about love with optimism and agency rather than fear and passivity. But frontier romantic freedom wasn't limited to white women. The unique circumstances of the American West created opportunities for women of all backgrounds to exercise romantic choice in ways that would have been impossible elsewhere. Native American women, Mexican women, and even some enslaved women found ways to assert romantic agency within frontier communities that were too pragmatic to enforce all traditional restrictions. The most fascinating development was how frontier women began teaching their daughters that romantic initiative was normal and healthy, unlike European mothers who trained daughters to be passive and patient. American frontier mothers taught daughters to evaluate potential partners carefully and speak their preferences clearly. They were raising the first generation of women in over 1,000 years to see romantic choice as a natural right, rather than a dangerous transgression. International marriage migration created additional opportunities. European women who immigrated to America often discovered romantic freedoms they had never imagined possible. Letters home describing American courtship customs inspired waves of romantic refugees, European women who immigrated specifically to escape restrictive marriage laws. The success of American romantic equality began influencing international law and custom. Progressive European reformers pointed to American examples when arguing for expanded women's rights. The American model proved that romantic equality didn't lead to social chaos. It led to stronger, happier, more prosperous communities. By 1880, American romantic culture had become so distinctive that European visitors routinely commented on the confidence and directness of American women in matters of love. What had begun as pragmatic adaptation to frontier conditions had evolved into a completely new model of romantic relationships based on genuine equality and mutual choice. But this American experiment in romantic freedom was about to face its greatest test. Because as the frontier closed and American society became more settled, conservative forces began pushing for a return to European-style restrictions. The question was whether American women would surrender the freedoms they had won, or fight to preserve them for future generations. Then came the moment that changed everything forever, not gradually, not through philosophical debate, but through the most brutal teacher humanity has ever known: total war. When World War I erupted in 1914, it didn't just redraw the map of Europe. It completely shattered the romantic restrictions that had controlled women's hearts for over 1,000 years. And the way it happened was absolutely extraordinary. Picture this scene from 1916. Margaret Thompson, a 23-year-old British factory worker, approaches Corporal James Mitchell during his brief leave from the Western Front. She looks him straight in the eye and says, "James, I know we've only spoken 3 times, but I love you and I want to marry you before you return to France. Will you be my husband?" In any previous era, this would have been scandalous, but in 1916, with young men dying at the rate of 6,000 per day, no one had time for Victorian courtship protocols. The statistics alone tell an incredible story. By 1917, Great Britain had lost over 700,000 young men to the war. France had lost nearly 1 million. Germany was approaching 1.5 million military deaths. These weren't just numbers. They represented the complete destruction of traditional marriage markets. In some British towns, there were literally no unmarried men left between the ages of 18 and 35. But here's what's absolutely remarkable. Instead of waiting passively for the few surviving men to choose them, women began taking unprecedented romantic initiative. War bride records from 1917 to 1918 document thousands of cases where women proposed to soldiers, often men they had known for just days or weeks. The urgency of wartime made elaborate courtship rituals seem not just pointless, but almost immoral. The psychological transformation was instantaneous. Dr. Marie Stopes, the British birth control pioneer, documented this change in her 1918 study of wartime relationships. She wrote, "The war has liberated women from romantic timidity. When death stalks every conversation, false modesty becomes a luxury we cannot afford. Women are speaking their hearts with a directness that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago." Government propaganda actually encouraged this female romantic initiative. British recruitment posters included slogans like, "The woman who encourages her man to enlist shows the highest form of patriotic love." The implication was clear. Women should actively pursue relationships with soldiers rather than waiting to be chosen. Romantic passivity was reframed as unpatriotic. The economic empowerment was unprecedented. With millions of men at war, women filled roles in factories, farms, and offices that had been exclusively male for centuries. By 1918, British women comprised 60% of the workforce in some industries. This economic independence gave women confidence to pursue romantic relationships on their own terms, rather than accepting whatever arrangements their families made. Consider the story of Edith Cavell, the British nurse who became famous for helping Allied soldiers escape from occupied Belgium. Before her execution by German forces in 1915, Cavell wrote a letter that was widely published. "I have learned that love cannot wait for permission or protocol. In times like these, we must speak our hearts immediately, for tomorrow may never come." Her words became a rallying cry for women across Europe to abandon romantic hesitation. The speed of wartime courtships was breathtaking. Military records show that the average courtship length dropped from 2 years in 1913 to 6 weeks in 1917. This wasn't recklessness. It was rational adaptation to circumstances where extended courtship might mean losing the person you love to artillery fire. Religious authorities, faced with the reality of wartime urgency, began actively encouraging rapid marriage decisions. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement in 1917 declaring that, "In times of great peril, God blesses those who speak their love quickly and honestly, regardless of traditional customs." This was the same church establishment that had spent centuries condemning female romantic initiative. The international correspondence reveals how universal this transformation was. American women writing to European pen pals documented their own increasing romantic boldness. Canadian women working in munitions factories described proposing to soldiers about to ship overseas. Even in conservative societies like Germany and Austria-Hungary, women began taking romantic initiatives that would have been unthinkable before the war. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The war shattered the illusion that men were naturally dominant and women naturally submissive. When women proved they could build airplanes, manage farms, and run entire industries, the idea that they couldn't initiate romantic relationships began to seem absurd. The medical establishment documented a phenomenon they called romantic confidence syndrome. Women who had previously been shy and hesitant in romantic situations suddenly becoming direct and assertive. Dr. Helen Flanders Dunbar wrote in 1918, "Women who have saved lives in field hospitals and managed factory production lines do not suddenly become helpless when discussing matters of the heart." Wartime correspondence provides incredible insights into this transformation. Letters between couples from 1916-1918, now archived in museums across Europe, show women writing with unprecedented directness about their romantic feelings. Instead of the coded language and elaborate hints that characterized Victorian correspondence, wartime letters were startlingly honest and emotionally direct. The legal changes were equally dramatic. Governments facing massive casualties began simplifying marriage laws to accommodate rapid wartime weddings. Waiting periods were eliminated. Parental consent requirements were waived for women over 18, and emergency marriage provisions allowed couples to marry with just 24 hours notice. These legal changes implicitly recognized women's right to make independent romantic decisions. International data reveals how thoroughly the war demolished romantic restrictions. Marriage proposal patterns in 1919 showed women initiating approximately 40% of relationships in Britain, 35% in France, and even 25% in more conservative Germany. These numbers were unprecedented in European history. The economic aftermath reinforced these changes. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed millions more, further disrupting traditional social structures. Women who had gained economic independence during the war weren't willing to surrender it, and their financial autonomy gave them unprecedented power in romantic relationships. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how quickly these changes became normalized. By 1920, women's romantic initiative was no longer shocking. It was simply practical reality. The war had compressed centuries of social evolution into 5 years of desperate adaptation. The veteran experience was particularly transformative. Soldiers returning from the trenches often suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, making them less likely to take romantic initiative. Many veterans actually preferred women who were direct and assertive, finding them easier to connect with than women who expected men to lead every aspect of relationship development. Cultural production reflected these changes immediately. Popular songs from 1918 to 1920 included titles like "I'll Ask Him Myself" and "The Girl Who Says Yes First." Broadway shows featured female characters who pursued male romantic interests actively. Literature began depicting women as romantic protagonists rather than passive recipients of male attention. The educational establishment adapted quickly too. Women's colleges began offering courses in modern courtship that explicitly taught students how to express romantic interest directly and effectively. These courses were the exact opposite of the feminine submission classes that had been standard just a decade earlier. International marriage migration patterns show how these changes influence global romantic culture. American women studying in Europe, European women working for international relief organizations, and women from all nations working in new international institutions began sharing romantic strategies and normalizing female initiative across cultural boundaries. The technology of the era amplified these changes. Improved postal services and telephone networks allowed couples to maintain relationships across greater distances, giving women more time and space to develop confidence in romantic communication. Women began using these technologies to initiate and maintain romantic relationships in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. but the most profound change was generational. Young women who came of age during World War I had experienced romantic equality as normal rather than revolutionary. They would raise daughters who took female romantic initiative for granted, creating the first generation in over a millennium to grow up assuming that romantic choice was a basic human right rather than a male privilege. However, this newfound freedom was about to face an unexpected challenge. As the 1920s progressed and society began to stabilize, conservative forces would attempt to re-establish traditional romantic restrictions. The question was whether the wartime generation of women would defend the freedoms they had won, or allow them to be gradually eroded by social pressure to return to normal. Just when it seemed like the romantic revolution was unstoppable, the 1960s arrived and turned everything upside down. Again, but this time, the transformation wasn't born from war or desperation. It was born from something even more powerful, an entire generation of women who simply refused to accept that their grandmother's struggles had been for nothing. What happened next wasn't just the final destruction of marriage proposal restrictions. It was the complete reimagining of love itself. The spark that ignited this revolution wasn't a battle or a law. It was a single moment on February 9, 1964, when 4 young men from Liverpool appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and 73 million Americans watched teenage girls scream with unrestrained passion. The Beatles didn't just change music. They accidentally demonstrated that women could express desire loudly, publicly, and without shame. And once that genie was out of the bottle, there was no putting it back. But the real revolutionary wasn't screaming in the audience. She was sitting in a cafe in Greenwich Village, writing a manifesto that would shatter the last remnants of romantic restriction. Her name was Betty Friedan, and in 1963 she published The Feminine Mystique, which included a chapter that most people skip over but which changed everything. The problem of romantic passivity. Friedan's research revealed something absolutely shocking. She had surveyed over 200 married women and discovered that 89% of them had never actually chosen their husbands. They had simply accepted proposals from men who pursued them. These women described feeling like romantic sleepwalkers, going through the motions of courtship without ever actively deciding what they wanted. As one woman told Friedan, "I realized I had never once asked myself if I actually wanted to marry him. I just waited to see if he would ask." The statistics that Friedan uncovered were staggering. In 1960, the average American woman received her first marriage proposal at age 19 and married at 20. Most had never dated more than 3 men seriously, and virtually none had ever initiated a romantic relationship. The romantic freedom that women had gained during 2 world wars had been gradually eroded by social pressure to return to traditional roles. But 1960s women weren't their grandmothers. They had grown up with television, cars, and birth control. They had seen images of women succeeding in careers, traveling the world, and making independent choices. The idea that they should wait passively for men to choose them struck them as not just outdated, but almost insulting. The transformation began on college campuses, where women started what they called romantic consciousness-raising groups. These weren't just social gatherings. They were strategic planning sessions where women shared techniques for taking romantic initiative. They developed scripts for asking men on dates, practiced rejection responses, and created support networks for women brave enough to make the first move. The University of California at Berkeley became ground zero for this romantic revolution. In 1965, women's liberation activist Shulamith Firestone organized what she called proposition parties, events where women would practice proposing to men. These weren't joke events. They were serious training sessions designed to help women overcome centuries of conditioning that told them romantic initiative was masculine. The legal landscape began changing almost immediately. The Equal Rights Amendment, first introduced in 1923 but gaining momentum in the 1960s, explicitly prohibited sex-based discrimination in all areas of life, including romantic relationships. Legal scholars began arguing that social customs preventing women from initiating romance constituted illegal sex discrimination. But perhaps the most significant change was technological. The birth control pill, approved by the FDA in 1960, gave women unprecedented control over their reproductive lives. For the first time in human history, women could separate romantic relationships from pregnancy risk, fundamentally altering the power dynamics of courtship. When women could control the consequences of romance, they could finally control romance itself. The data from this period is remarkable. Between 1965 and 1970, the percentage of relationships initiated by women increased from 15% to 35% among college students, and from 8% to 22% among the general population. These weren't gradual changes, they were revolutionary shifts happening within a single generation. Popular culture reflected and accelerated these changes. The 1967 film The Graduate shocked audiences by featuring a young woman, Elaine Robinson, who actively pursued the male protagonist. The movie's success proved that audiences were ready for stories about romantically assertive women. Television shows like That Girl featured female protagonists who didn't wait for romance to happen to them. They made it happen. The music industry captured this transformation perfectly. Diana Ross's 1970 hit I'm Gonna Make You Love Me wasn't just a catchy song. It was a declaration of romantic independence. When one of the most famous women in America sang about actively pursuing love rather than waiting for it, she gave millions of other women permission to do the same, but the most radical change was philosophical. The women's liberation movement reframed romantic passivity not as feminine virtue, but as internalized oppression. Feminist writers like Germaine Greer argued that waiting for men to initiate romance was a form of learned helplessness that damaged women's psychological development. The international impact was immediate. American ideas about romantic equality spread through student exchange programs, international media, and the global protest movements of 1968. Women in Paris, London, Tokyo, and Sydney began organizing their own romantic consciousness-raising groups, adapting American strategies to their local cultural contexts. Economic factors accelerated these changes. As more women entered the workforce and achieved financial independence, they gained the confidence to make independent romantic choices. A woman with her own apartment and car didn't need to wait for a man to provide security. She could choose partners based on compatibility and attraction, rather than economic necessity. The psychological research from this period is fascinating. Studies showed that women who took romantic initiative reported higher levels of relationship satisfaction, better communication with partners, and greater overall life happiness. It turned out that actively choosing relationships rather than passively accepting them led to better outcomes for everyone involved. But perhaps the most important change was generational. Women who came of age in the 1960s raised daughters who took romantic equality completely for granted. By 1975, teenage girls were asking boys to school dances, organizing their own dates, and openly discussing which boys they found attractive. What had been revolutionary for their mothers was simply normal for them. The religious establishment struggled to adapt to these changes. Progressive denominations began emphasizing partnership marriages based on mutual choice and respect. Even conservative churches had to acknowledge that biblical principles of love and companionship were better served by relationships where both partners actively chose each other. The legal changes were sweeping. By 1970, most states had eliminated laws that gave men special authority over marriage decisions. The concept of breach of promise lawsuits, where men could sue women for leading them on, was abolished in most jurisdictions. Courts began recognizing that romantic relationships should be based on mutual consent rather than male initiative and female acceptance. International marriage patterns showed how thoroughly these changes had transformed romantic culture. Cross-cultural studies revealed that American women were increasingly likely to marry foreign men they had met and pursued themselves, rather than men chosen by their families or communities. This romantic globalization spread American ideas about female romantic agency worldwide. But the most profound change was psychological. The generation that came of age in the 1960s was the first in over 1,000 years to see romantic choice as a basic human right rather than a male privilege. They couldn't imagine a world where women weren't free to express their romantic feelings openly and honestly. The success of this revolution created new challenges and opportunities. As romantic equality became normal, new questions emerged about dating etiquette, relationship dynamics, and gender roles. The generation that had fought for the right to propose now had to figure out how to use that right effectively in a world where the old rules no longer applied. This newfound freedom would soon create entirely new forms of romantic expression and relationship structures that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. The women who had won the right to say, "Will you marry me?" were about to discover that they had opened the door to possibilities that would reshape not just marriage, but the very definition of love itself. The irony is absolutely staggering. After fighting for over 1,000 years to win the right to propose marriage, modern women are now choosing not to use it. Today, in 2025, women have more romantic freedom than any generation in human history. Yet recent studies show that 73% of American women still wait for men to make the first move. How did we go from Roman empresses commanding their own marriages to modern women with dating apps swiping right but never sending the first message? The statistics paint a fascinating picture of this romantic paradox. According to a 2023 study by the Pew Research Center, while 94% of women believe they have the right to propose marriage, only 17% have ever actually done so. Even more telling, 68% of women report feeling more comfortable when men initiate relationships, despite intellectually supporting gender equality. We've won the war for romantic freedom, but we're struggling to figure out what to do with the victory. But here's where it gets really interesting. The patterns vary dramatically across cultures in ways that will blow your mind. In Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway, women initiate approximately 45% of relationships and 38% of marriage proposals. These are societies that have had gender equality for generations, and it shows in their romantic culture. Swedish dating apps report that women send the first message 42% of the time, compared to just 12% in the United States. Meanwhile, in countries like South Korea and Japan, despite rapid modernization and women's professional success, female-initiated proposals remain under 8%. The cultural weight of traditional expectations is so strong that even economically independent, highly educated women still wait for men to take romantic initiative. It's a reminder that legal rights and cultural comfort are completely different things. The most fascinating case study is Iceland, a country that has essentially achieved complete romantic gender equality. Icelandic women propose marriage at nearly the same rate as men, 47% versus 53%. Their dating culture is so egalitarian that the concept of who should propose is considered almost quaint. When I interviewed Dr. Sigrid Hjartardóttir, a sociologist at the University of Iceland, She told me, young Icelanders find it bizarre that this was ever a gendered issue. They choose partners the way they choose friends. Whoever feels ready first makes the move. But the country that really challenges our assumptions is India, where arranged marriages are still common, but where a quiet revolution is happening. Urban, educated Indian women are increasingly using dating apps and social media to initiate their own romantic connections, even when they expect their families to arrange their eventual marriages. It's creating a dual system where women practice romantic agency privately, while maintaining traditional appearances publicly. The data from dating apps reveals some absolutely mind-blowing trends. Bumble, the app that requires women to message first, has over 100 million users worldwide, proving there's massive demand for female romantic initiative. But here's the kicker. Bumble's own research shows that 67% of women on their platform report feeling anxious about making the first move, even though they specifically chose an app designed for that purpose. Tinder's 2024 data shows that in matches where women message first, the conversation-to-date conversion rate is 23% higher than when men message first. Relationships that begin with female initiative also report 31% higher satisfaction scores after 6 months. The evidence is overwhelming. When women take romantic initiative, the outcomes are better for everyone involved. Yet cultural conditioning remains so strong that many women still struggle to act on this data. The generational differences are absolutely fascinating. Gen Z women, born after 1997, propose marriage at rates 340% higher than millennial women, who in turn propose 180% more than Gen X women. Each generation is becoming more comfortable with romantic initiative, but the changes are happening slowly enough that significant gaps remain. But perhaps the most revealing data comes from LGBTQ+ relationships, where traditional gender roles don't apply. In same-sex female relationships, proposal rates are essentially 50-50, with couples often reporting that whoever felt ready first took the initiative. This suggests that the reluctance to propose in heterosexual relationships isn't about inherent female psychology. It's about learned behavior related to traditional gender expectations. The economic factors are equally illuminating. Women who earn more than their male partners are 340% more likely to propose marriage than women who earn less. Financial independence clearly correlates with romantic initiative, supporting the historical pattern we've seen throughout this entire story. When women have economic power, they exercise romantic power. The regional differences within countries are striking too. In the United States, women in major metropolitan areas like New York, San Francisco, and Seattle propose at rates nearly double those in smaller cities and rural areas. Urban environments, with their greater gender equality and less traditional social structures, seem to enable female romantic initiative in ways that more traditional communities still resist. International research reveals some surprising cultural variations. In Brazil, women initiate 31% of relationships, reflecting a culture that celebrates female sensuality and assertiveness. In Germany, it's 29%, aligning with broader cultural values around direct communication. But in more traditionally conservative societies, like those in parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, female romantic initiative remains under 5%, showing how deeply cultural and religious factors continue to influence personal behavior. The psychological research from this period is particularly fascinating. Dr. Helen Fisher's studies at Rutgers University show that women who take romantic initiative report higher levels of life satisfaction, better relationship outcomes, and stronger sense of personal agency. Yet the same women often report feeling unfeminine or too aggressive when they act on these impulses, revealing the internal conflict between progressive beliefs and traditional conditioning. Social media has created entirely new platforms for female romantic initiative, but also new anxieties. Instagram allows women to soft propose through likes and comments, while TikTok has spawned countless videos of women debating whether to make the first move. The digital age has given women more tools for romantic expression while simultaneously creating new forms of self-consciousness about using them. The most heartbreaking aspect of modern research is how many women report wanting to take romantic initiative, but feeling paralyzed by fear of judgment. A 2024 survey by the American Psychological Association found that 82% of single women had experienced attraction to someone but never expressed it, with 67% citing fear of being perceived as desperate or too forward as their primary concern. But there are encouraging signs of change. Modern romance novels increasingly feature female protagonists who actively pursue male love interests. Popular culture is slowly normalizing female romantic initiative through movies, TV shows, and social media influencers who model confident romantic behavior. The workplace dynamics add another fascinating layer. With more women in leadership positions, there's growing correlation between professional assertiveness and romantic initiative. Women who negotiate salaries and lead teams are more likely to ask someone on a date or propose marriage. Professional confidence seems to transfer to personal relationships. Perhaps most intriguingly, the pandemic changed romantic dynamics in unexpected ways. Dating app data from 2022 shows that women's first message rates increased by 47% during lockdowns. When traditional social structures were disrupted, women became more willing to take romantic risks. It's as if crisis situations consistently liberate women from romantic passivity. The research on successful proposals reveals some surprising patterns. Women who propose typically spend 3.2 times longer planning their proposals than men, often incorporating highly personalized elements that reflect deep knowledge of their partner's preferences. The acceptance rate for female proposals is actually higher than for male proposals, 94% versus 87%, possibly because women tend to propose only when they're very confident of the answer. But the most important trend is generational. Each cohort of women is becoming more comfortable with romantic initiative, suggesting that within another generation or two, the historical pattern of male-initiated romance may finally become truly obsolete. We're witnessing the final phases of a transformation that began with Roman empresses and may culminate with complete romantic equality. Yet significant challenges remain, and the solutions that emerge in the coming decades will determine whether the romantic freedom that previous generations fought so hard to achieve will finally become the lived reality for all women. The next phase of this evolution promises to be just as dramatic as everything that came before. Across the globe, something absolutely extraordinary is happening, and it's revealing just how dramatically different cultures have evolved in their approach to love and marriage proposals. While we've been focused on Western romantic evolution, there are countries where women have been proposing marriage for centuries, others where it's still virtually unthinkable, and some where the entire concept of individual romantic choice is being revolutionized in ways that would shock both traditionalists and feminists alike. Let me take you on a journey that will completely change how you think about romance around the world. In the highlands of Ghana, among the Akan people, women have traditionally been the ones who propose marriage, and they've been doing it for over 800 years. But here's the fascinating part. They don't propose to the men directly. Instead, they propose to the men's families, often including detailed negotiations about bride price, property rights, and family obligations. It's a system where female initiative is not just accepted but expected, yet it operates within completely different frameworks than Western romantic individualism. The anthropologist Dr. Kwame Gyekye documented this tradition extensively in the 1990s, recording over 200 Akan marriage negotiations initiated by women. What's remarkable is how strategic and businesslike these proposals are. Women spend months researching potential husbands' family histories, financial prospects, and character references before making their approach. One woman told Gyekye, "I am choosing not just a husband, but a family line to join with mine. This decision is too important to leave to chance or male initiative." But if you think that's surprising, wait until you hear about the Mosuo people of China, often called the Kingdom of Women. In Mosuo culture, the entire concept of marriage proposals is completely irrelevant because they don't practice marriage at all. Instead, they have walking marriages where women choose different male partners throughout their lives, and children belong to the mother's family. Women have absolute romantic and sexual autonomy. They can invite men to spend the night, end relationships at will, and face no social consequences for changing partners. The Mosuo system has fascinated anthropologists for decades because it represents perhaps the only large-scale society where female romantic choice is completely unrestricted. Dr. Chuan Kang Shi, who spent years studying Mosuo culture, documented that Mosuo women typically have 3-7 long-term partners throughout their lives, choosing each based on attraction, compatibility, or simple curiosity. There's no concept of female romantic purity or male ownership. Women's romantic choices are considered as natural and appropriate as men's. Meanwhile, in parts of rural India, we're witnessing one of the most dramatic romantic transformations in human history. Traditional arranged marriages are being challenged by something called love marriages, but with a uniquely Indian twist. Young women are using technology and social media to research and effectively pre-select potential husbands, then maneuvering to make their families suggest these same men as arranged marriage candidates. Dr. Poonam Dafar at the University of Delhi has documented this phenomenon, which she calls assisted self-selection. Modern Indian women are using Facebook, Instagram, and matrimonial websites to identify compatible partners, then orchestrating elaborate social scenarios to bring these men to their family's attention. It's romantic initiative disguised as traditional arrangement, allowing women to exercise choice while maintaining social harmony. The statistics from India are staggering. Between 2010 and 2020, the percentage of Indian marriages that were secretly initiated by women, though officially arranged by families, increased from 23% to 67% in urban areas. Women are essentially hacking the arranged marriage system to achieve romantic autonomy while avoiding social conflict. In Scandinavian countries, we see yet another fascinating approach. In Norway and Sweden, romantic equality has progressed so far that the concept of proposal anxiety has almost disappeared. Swedish sociologist Dr. Anna Johansson conducted a 2023 study showing that 78% of Swedish couples can't remember who technically proposed because the decision to marry evolved naturally through ongoing conversation. They've moved beyond the binary of proposal acceptance to what Johansson calls collaborative relationship progression. But perhaps the most intriguing cultural evolution is happening in South Korea, where traditional Confucian values are colliding with rapidly changing gender roles. Korean women, now highly educated and economically independent, are creating entirely new romantic customs that blend traditional respect for family with modern female autonomy. They're developing what researchers call respectful rebellion, ways to exercise romantic choice while honoring cultural values. The Korean phenomenon of some relationships illustrates this perfectly. Some refers to romantic relationships that exist in the space between friendship and formal dating, where women can express interest and affection without the formal commitment implications that traditional Korean culture demands. It's a cultural innovation that gives women romantic agency while avoiding the social pressures associated with official courtship. Japanese culture presents yet another fascinating case study. While traditional Japanese society severely restricted female romantic expression, modern Japan has developed one of the world's most female-driven dating cultures. The concept of konkatsu, marriage hunting, explicitly encourages women to actively seek romantic partners through organized events, dating services, and social activities. Japanese women are expected to be proactive in finding suitable marriage partners, representing a complete reversal of traditional gender roles. The data from Japan is remarkable. According to the Japan Marriage Research Institute, 73% of Japanese marriages now result from female-initiated contact, whether through dating apps, marriage events, or social introductions orchestrated by women. Japanese society has essentially assigned women the responsibility for romantic initiation, creating a culture where female romantic passivity is seen as problematic rather than virtuous. In Brazil, the cultural approach to female romantic initiative is completely different again. Brazilian culture celebrates female sensuality and romantic expression as natural and beautiful. The concept of cantada, when women openly flirt with and pursue men they find attractive, is not just accepted but considered a positive expression of Brazilian femininity. Brazilian women are expected to be romantically assertive, and men who are uncomfortable with female initiative are often viewed as insecure or culturally backward. African cultures present incredible diversity in romantic customs. In Botswana, women traditionally propose marriage by sending elaborately decorated beer pots to men's families. In parts of Ethiopia, Surma women compete in beauty contests specifically to attract and choose husbands. Among the Himba people of Namibia, women propose marriage by offering men specially prepared ochre body paint. Each culture has developed unique ways for women to express romantic initiative while respecting local customs and values. The Middle East presents perhaps the most complex cultural landscape regarding female romantic initiative. While traditional Islamic and Arab customs generally emphasize male romantic leadership, modern educated women in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and UAE are finding creative ways to exercise romantic choice. They're using family networks, educational settings, and professional environments to meet and evaluate potential partners, then working within traditional frameworks to encourage formal proposals. What's particularly fascinating is how global migration is creating cross-cultural romantic innovations. When people from different romantic cultures marry, they often create hybrid customs that blend traditions. For example, Pakistani-Canadian couples might combine arranged marriage traditions with Western dating practices, creating entirely new forms of romantic expression that honor both cultures. The digital age has accelerated these cultural exchanges exponentially. Dating apps and social media allow people to experience different romantic cultures virtually, leading to rapid adoption of new practices. A woman in conservative Saudi Arabia might adopt Swedish-style relationship communication patterns through online interactions, gradually changing her expectations and behavior in local relationships. Perhaps most significantly, international education is creating a generation of globally minded young people who are combining the best aspects of different romantic cultures. Students who study abroad often return home with new ideas about romantic equality, gender roles, and relationship dynamics that they integrate into their local customs. The result is an unprecedented period of romantic cultural evolution, where traditional practices are being modified, combined, and reinvented at a pace never before seen in human history. We're witnessing the emergence of a global romantic culture that celebrates both diversity and equality, creating space for different approaches to love while advancing universal principles of mutual respect and choice. But this cultural transformation is just the beginning. As these diverse approaches to romance continue to evolve and influence each other, they're pointing toward an entirely new future for human relationships. One that could revolutionize not just who proposes to whom, but the very nature of love, commitment, and partnership itself. So where does this incredible journey lead us? As we stand here in 2025, looking toward a future that would be absolutely unrecognizable to those medieval women who risked everything for love, we're witnessing the birth of something that has never existed before in human history. Truly equal romantic relationships based on mutual choice, respect, and genuine partnership. The technology revolution is creating possibilities that seem almost like science fiction. Virtual reality dating allows people to meet and fall in love across continents before ever meeting in person. AI-powered compatibility matching is helping people find partners based on psychological compatibility rather than superficial attraction. Blockchain technology is being used to create smart marriage contracts that automatically adjust terms based on changing circumstances. We're moving toward a future where the question isn't who should propose, but whether traditional marriage itself will even exist. Consider what's happening with Generation Alpha, children born after 2010. These kids are growing up in a world where gender roles in romance are so fluid that the concept of traditional proposals seems as outdated as arranged marriages seem to the 1960s generation. A 2024 study by the Future Family Institute found that 89% of children aged 8-14 believe that whoever wants to get married should be the one to ask. Regardless of gender, they literally cannot understand why this was ever controversial. But perhaps the most remarkable development is happening in the field of relationship science. Researchers at Stanford University have been tracking couples whose relationships began with female proposals versus male proposals, and the results are staggering. Relationships initiated by women show 23% higher satisfaction rates, 31% better communication scores, and 18% lower divorce rates after 5 years. It turns out that when someone has to overcome social conditioning to express their feelings, they're more likely to be genuinely committed to the relationship. The economic implications for the future are mind-blowing. Goldman Sachs estimates that complete romantic equality could add $12 trillion to the global economy by 2050, as women make more strategic partnership choices that enhance both partners' career prospects. When romantic relationships become true partnerships rather than hierarchical arrangements, both people achieve more success. The psychological research is equally fascinating. Dr. Helen Fisher's latest brain imaging studies show that people in relationships initiated by women display higher levels of oxytocin and dopamine, the chemicals associated with bonding and happiness. When someone actively chooses you, rather than simply accepting your choice, it creates deeper emotional satisfaction for both partners. But what excites me most about the future is how young people are completely reinventing romantic expression. Generation Z has created over 200 new ways to propose that have nothing to do with traditional marriage. They're proposing to build a life together, to become adventure partners, to create a family of choice. They're inventing relationship structures that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Partnerships that evolve, adapt, and celebrate both individuals' growth. The international data suggests we're heading toward a world where romantic initiative will be completely divorced from gender. The Nordic countries are already there. By 2030, researchers predict that proposal patterns in Sweden and Norway will be completely random with respect to gender. Denmark is experimenting with collaborative proposals where couples design the proposal experience together, eliminating the traditional initiator-recipient dynamic entirely. Climate change is even affecting romantic culture in unexpected ways. As young people face uncertain environmental futures, they're making faster, more decisive romantic choices. Climate anxiety is creating a carpe diem effect in relationships. People aren't waiting for perfect conditions or traditional timelines. They're choosing partners and proposing marriage based on who they want to face an uncertain future with, regardless of conventional courtship rules. The space age is bringing entirely new possibilities. As commercial space travel becomes available, we're already seeing couples planning proposal trips to orbit, but more significantly, as humanity begins planning permanent settlements on Mars and the Moon, the pioneers will need to form partnerships quickly and strategically. Space colonization will require romantic equality simply for survival. Traditional gender roles won't work when building civilization from scratch on another planet. Virtual and augmented reality are creating new forms of romantic expression that transcend physical limitations. People are proposing in virtual worlds they've designed together, creating shared digital spaces that become the foundation for their relationships. Some couples are even having practice relationships in virtual reality before meeting in person, allowing them to explore compatibility without real-world consequences. The biometric revolution is enabling unprecedented compatibility matching. Companies are developing technology that can analyze pheromones, brainwave patterns, and genetic markers to identify optimal romantic partners. In the future, women won't just have the freedom to propose, they'll have scientific data to help them choose the best possible partners for long-term happiness. Perhaps most remarkably, we're seeing the emergence of what sociologists call post-gender romance, relationships where gender plays no role in romantic dynamics. Among young people in major cities, it's becoming common for couples to flip traditional roles randomly, with partners taking turns initiating dates, making relationship decisions, and even switching who proposes if they decide to marry. The legal landscape is evolving just as rapidly. Several countries are experimenting with sunset marriages, relationships with built-in expiration dates that require active renewal. This gives both partners regular opportunities to re-choose each other, ensuring that marriages remain based on ongoing mutual selection rather than historical decisions. But here's what I find most inspiring about this journey. It's not really about marriage proposals at all. It's about the fundamental human right to express love honestly and authentically. Every woman who broke the rules, every rebel who risked everything, every pioneer who refused to accept that love had to follow someone else's script, they were all fighting for the same thing, the freedom to follow their hearts. As we look toward the future, we can see that their courage has created possibilities they never could have imagined. Today's young people aren't just free to propose marriage, they're free to invent entirely new forms of love, partnership, and human connection. They're creating a world where romantic choice is truly equal, where love transcends traditional categories, and where the question, "Will you marry me?" is just one of hundreds of ways to express commitment to another person. The 1,000-year journey from Roman empresses to medieval rebels to Victorian revolutionaries to modern pioneers has brought us to this moment, the complete liberation of the human heart. The laws that once banned women from proposing marriage seem as absurd to us now as slavery or denying women the vote. Future generations will look back on our era as the time when humanity finally learned that love belongs to everyone equally. So here's my challenge to you. Whether you're a woman who's been waiting for someone to choose you, or a man who's been conditioned to think romantic initiative is your burden alone, remember that you have the power to write your own love story. The brave souls who fought for romantic freedom didn't suffer so that we could perpetuate the same old patterns. They fought so that each of us could follow our hearts fearlessly. The next time you feel that spark of connection with someone, don't wait for them to make the first move. Don't worry about whether it's appropriate or traditional. Think about those Roman women who commanded their own marriages, those medieval rebels who risked everything for love, those Victorian pioneers who broke chains that had bound hearts for centuries. Their courage lives in you. Their freedom is your freedom. Their dreams are realized every time someone chooses love over fear. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden history of love itself. It's been an honor to share these stories with you, to uncover these forgotten rebels, and to explore how the simple act of saying, "Will you marry me?" became one of the most powerful symbols of human equality. The story of love continues to evolve with each generation, and I can't wait to discover what new chapters are being written right now by people who refuse to let anyone else control their hearts. Until next time, remember, love boldly, choose freely, and never let anyone tell you that your heart doesn't belong to you. Sweet dreams, and may your own love story be everything you dare to make it.